Welcome to Echoes International podcast, with teaching, interviews and stories of what God is doing straight from the mission field and also within the UK. For more podcasts, stories and opportunities to get involved, check out our website at echoesinternational.org.uk and our other social media channels.
My father, he's a church planter to this day in Bogota, Colombia, the capital city. And as I grew up, I always had the privilege and opportunity to follow my dad and see what he was doing and learn from his experience. However, a very important principle within Christianity is that God has no grandchildren. He only has children. And so despite the fact that I, from a very early age, probably about as young as you, I was learning the scriptures. I was able to have my mother tell me Bible stories at night and be able to attend a church and be able to pray with my parents. But it was a very definite moment when I had to come to that realization on my own that I was a sinner and that as a result of my sin, I deserved death, and that Jesus, he took my place. He decided to die for me and out of love give his life so that I could be forgiven. And as basic as that sounds, it's something that is understandable for a young little boy. And I accepted that, I believed that, and little by little, those principles of the scriptures started to take shape in my life. And as I was growing up, I enjoyed being a part of the churches that my dad was starting in Colombia. I was able to participate in the ministry actively and sometimes just be there with my dad or go wherever he was preaching, and to see him go about that ministry was a great influence. However, when I went to college, I left Colombia, I went to the United States, and that was a really key moment in my life. I think that the majority of you here today are from 18 to 25 or so, and I really think that that time period in my life was perhaps the most significant in my own relationship with God. Why? Well, I had just left my parents' household and I was living on my own. I felt really grown up, and I started studying and interacting with other youth, and it was there where I really had to take ownership for all the things that I had believed in up until then. And there was nobody looking at me as the son of the missionary. There was nobody who had any expectation for me. And so it was whether or not I was willing to stand up for the things that I said I had believed in ever since I was a kid. And I remember it being kind of an awesome adventure, a huge experience of starting to see how Christ was more than just a story, how he was really my friend, and how I was really able to start following him, as Willie said, in the context of the university. And that determined the friendships I made, the way I spent my time. And I just remember how that was a really amazing time in my life where I grew a lot. Especially my first year in college, I got involved with a missions group, and it was called Chai Time. And so we would meet and drink chai tea and talk about missions. And that was always something that I was interested in, maybe in the long run, that somehow I would follow in the footsteps of my parents and also become a missionary. I didn't really have it all figured out by then, but it attracted me, and I saw the value in praying for other missionaries because I myself had been a missionary kid. And so I understood what it was like to be on the field there and to be concerned about the Lord's work. There was one time in that missions group, however, where I remember we were praying for like the safe travels of some missionary out in Africa. And in the middle of that prayer time, I just started getting restless. I was like, this is kind of crazy that I'm praying for the travels of a missionary in Africa, but am I really willing to go out there and to share the gospel on my own? Do I really have to think about Africa, or can I just do it right here? And so I was in a Christian college, and I started getting restless, and there was, on that very night, I left the campus, and to the first person I found, I just like went up and started talking to them, and I started asking them what they felt or what they thought about God and what they considered their own life to mean in regards to eternity and who Jesus Christ was. And so that was something that I just knew that I needed to start in some way expressing the things that Jesus was putting inside of me, that I couldn't just leave them there, but rather like a spring of living water, I needed to let it flow and to let it flow through me and find opportunities to connect with other people concerning the gospel. Well, that summer, after my first year of college, I got my first job. I was working with a utility construction company, and I was living alone in a farmhouse, and I would go on runs and come back and do push-ups and sit-ups, and then I would go to work in the morning, and the work context was really like something that I wasn't experienced to before then. I mean, these were pretty rough guys that spoke vulgarly and who had just very poor standards of morality. And it was within that context that I saw the importance of sharing the gospel. And it was awkward because I was the newest guy on the job, and I was the guy that really wasn't very good at what I was doing, but nonetheless, I was going to stand up for what I believed in. And even though at times my workers, they kind of made fun of me, like I decided that, you know, Jesus is who I'm going to identify with. And I could try to hide my friendship or my relationship with Jesus, or I could just live up to it and try to engage in spiritual conversations with these other men about who Jesus was. And even though at the beginning it was tough because, as I said, I was the youngest guy, I was not very good at the job I was doing, little by little they started to respect me even for that, because they saw that I was willing to stand up for something. And I wonder, like, how many people are really willing to stand up for something in life? How many people are really willing to fight for the truth and to give their lives for something greater than themselves? And those were the big existential questions that I started asking myself in those college years. Like, what am I going to live for? Is there something worthwhile that I can just completely dedicate my life to? And I found that in Jesus Christ. After that summer, I went to another college where I was focusing more on the Bible, and there again I started getting this restless feeling like, hey, like I'm in this bubble, like Willie said, and where are the opportunities to share the gospel? I had been doing that in my other work context, and when I got home, I would just look for opportunities to read the scriptures, to praise God, and to pray on my own, because that's what would fill me up to then go and be able to share the gospel in those other contexts. But as I was in this college, I was just like getting all this information, and I was like, whoa, like I'm going to be responsible for this information. You know, for him who is given much, much will be required. And I was receiving so much, I was like, I need to do something about this. And there again, I started getting restless. I started waking up super early in the morning, and I would pray, and I didn't really know what to pray for, but I just knew that God was speaking to me in some way or another. And little by little, I started feeling like I needed to go back to Colombia, and I wanted to be a missionary there. And I had started thinking about all the things that I had seen and I had even heard on the news, and how Colombia had suffered through many years of political turmoil and insurgent violence, and all these things started intriguing me that, hey, most the guys my age in Colombia, they were in the military. You know, like there's a military draft, and after college or after high school, there's a good percentage of young men that go into the military and serve. Well, I was wondering, how could I serve my country? And I knew that the real reason the country was the way it was because people, they didn't know Christ. And if they don't know Christ, then of course there's going to be a lot of problems. And so I felt like that was the root cause. And in my idealistic and ambitious mind, I was like, no, I'm gonna go back to Colombia, and I'm gonna preach the gospel, and I'm gonna save those guerrillas and those drug traffickers, and like the country's gonna get better. And I even called my dad up. I was like, Dad, I think I need to quit college, and I just need to go back to the jungles of Colombia and try to find a way to preach the gospel. I think it's really important. And my dad didn't think that was a good idea. He actually thought I should finish college first, and so I was like, okay, I'll try to finish college. And then another day went by, and I just kept like feeling this restlessness. So I called him up again. I was like, Dad, are you sure? Like, I really think maybe I could just go to Colombia, like figure stuff out, and then come back to college later. But I feel like I have to act on my impulse, what I'm feeling right now. And he's like, no, like you went to college to study. You went to college even because you had a girlfriend there, and I did have a girlfriend at the time. That's why I transferred colleges. And in my mind, it was kind of like, how am I going to lead in this relationship if I'm ignoring this huge sense of responsibility and this huge burden that I have in my heart to serve the Lord? And I was scared as to how that relationship would develop if I would somehow neglect that which I thought Jesus was burdening me with and inspiring me in my heart. And so I kept asking him, and I felt kind of like my namesake, you know, when God starts speaking to him, and he goes to Eli a couple times, or actually 3 times, and he's like, are you talking to me? And he's like, no, go back to bed, until finally he realizes that it was God talking to him. Well, I never went back to Colombia to go to the jungles and preach the gospel to the guerrillas. In fact, I did finish college, and I believe that it was through that perseverance for the next 4 years of keeping that dream alive that it became a lot more real than just some crazy ambition that had sprung up out of nowhere. I don't deny that the Lord was speaking to me at that time, but he spoke to me in a lot more profound ways as I had to struggle through college, struggle through friendships and relationships, and keep that dream alive and make decisions that would help in arriving at that goal that I at one time had perceived as being so real, and I sensed as being so clearly coming from God. It was through involvement in a church. It was through involvement in a missions group. It was through camps like this where I was once again refreshed in my longing and my desire to serve the Lord. And so in the times that I was on my own, I would study missionary biographies. I would read the scriptures on my own and find ways to go out into the town and meet people in burger joints and talk to them about Jesus, like I realized that I needed to start doing it right there where I was. And eventually I did get commended to become a missionary, to go back to Colombia. And it was as if when my dreams touched the ground, it wasn't quite what I expected, but it was a lot more than what I had dreamed of. And as I arrived there, I realized that all those years of preparation, of perseverance, were really what was necessary for me to then do something that lasted and that mattered for Christ as I was a missionary. Because the struggles and the difficulties there on the mission field were a lot harder than the perseverance that was necessary to make it to the mission field. But by having persevered for those 4 years beforehand is what then gave me the strength to carry on in the midst of this overwhelming disappointment as I was on the ground running. And so I'm going to tell you guys more about that whole experience once I did arrive in Colombia. But I want to mention one small thing about this. And as a side note, I have a friend here named Juan David. He's also from Colombia. He's accompanying me. And he actually joined me about half a year after I arrived in a jungle city of Colombia to help me out in planting a church there. But before he arrived, there was something that I always look back as being like a definitive moment in my life. And I always look back at this time as being something that confirmed what God wanted me to do. See, I had dreamed about reaching a lot of people, just standing up in the middle of the jungle and saying, repent, kind of like John the Baptist, and follow Jesus. And when I got there, that wasn't how it was. That wasn't how it worked. Like, I went and I started walking around the street. I started talking to people about Jesus. No one seemed really that interested. I started playing basketball, and I wanted to bring all these guys that I was playing basketball with over to a Bible study, but only one of them showed up. And so it wasn't quite what I had dreamed of, and I was starting to feel frustrated. Like, how in the world am I supposed to start a church? Like, I've been trying to do this, like, I've been projecting myself and dreaming about this for 5 years, and here I am in the middle of a humid room in this sketchy part of the city where I don't know anyone. I started feeling really lonely and confused as to whether or not I had really invested those last 4 years in something that mattered. Like, is this all there is to it? Is this all there is to being a missionary? And in the middle of all those thoughts, I walked out to the river port on the northern end of the city of San Jose, where I was serving as a missionary. And I arrived there right as the sun was setting. See, at 6 p.m. and at 6 a.m., every single day in Colombia, the sun rises and the sun sets. We're so close to the equator that we don't have seasons where, like, it starts getting night at like 4 p.m. or anything crazy like what happens here. It starts getting dark at like 10 p.m. That's ridiculous. There it's always 6 a.m. and 6 p.m. And so as the sun was setting, I was looking out at the river, and I could see a flag of Colombia on the top of a boat. And I took that picture, and I'll probably show you guys that picture later on. But as is the custom in Colombia, both at 6 a.m. and at 6 p.m. every single day, they play the national anthem. And there's a part of that anthem, there's a few verses within that anthem that says, "The horrible night has ended. The sublime liberty pours the dawn. The whole of humanity, crying out in its chains, comprehends the words of him who died on the cross. That's in the national anthem of Colombia. Comprehend the words of him who died on the cross. And as I was looking out at this beautiful sunset, and as I was seeing this flag of Colombia, and I was hearing in the foreground, in the background, this anthem that was saying, comprehend the words of him who died on the cross. Those words hit me like they had never done before. And at that moment, I realized that more than anything else, more than serving the Lord, more than being a missionary and reaching a lot of other people for Jesus, I first needed to be the ones to comprehend Jesus and to comprehend his words. And more than just comprehend his words, I needed to believe them. And more than believing them, I had to act upon them and to also encourage others to do the same. But just like Willie was saying, I guess you kind of go back to that principle of realizing that before anything else that I do, I first have to be. I first have to know who Jesus is in my life and be willing to follow after him and learn from him, because he is tender and he is humble, and he says, learn from me, because my yoke is easy and my burden is light. And that was a huge relief at that moment, because I realized that it wasn't a matter of me reaching tons and tons of people for Christ, although I wished and I still desire to do that in my life. What really matters is that I just know who Jesus is, and I can learn about him every day more and more, and learn from him and imitate him. And as I walk with him, he'll be in charge of the work. Like, it's not my responsibility. I'm just required to follow him. And little by little, as I follow him, whether the fruit comes or not, as far as the ministry is concerned, my first requirement is to believe in him and to comprehend him and to follow after him. And so that's what I desire for all of you during this camp, that we can also come to know Jesus a little bit better, that we can be so audacious as to start to follow him and start to believe some of the things that he said, and consider how in our lives these truths that were declared 2,000 years ago are relevant still today, and how we're going to apply them in the context of our schools, of our jobs, within our friendships. Like, how are we going to make Jesus our true Lord and Savior in every aspect of our lives? And so I'm really eager to spend this time with you and to also learn from a lot of you. And Juan David and I have a few stories that we can tell you about what God is doing in Colombia. But I really thank you for this opportunity, and even more so to consider that here in Scotland and Great Britain and the UK, it was like a few hundred years back that there was some people that decided to start gathering together because they were reading the scriptures and they realized that God wanted them to go back to the basics, to go back to what it really meant to be a follower of Jesus. And so they were brave in going against the status quo, against what religion and what culture was teaching them. And they decided to only be taught by the scriptures themselves. And because of that, then the missionary movement of the Brethren spread to the United States, and to the United States it spread to South America, and here we are a few hundred years later. And I'm a product of that effort, of that missionary effort, and now I too am carrying on that legacy of handing on the baton to others, to encourage them to go back to the scriptures and to consider these New Testament principles that are really revolutionary if you think about them and if you're willing to apply them. But it's an awesome adventure, and it's really encouraging for me to be here, and I just really hope and pray that this can be an enriching time and a time of growth, both for me personally as well as for all of you. Thank you very much.
We hope you're encouraged and inspired and ready to answer the call. Thank you for listening.